Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Somebody in the chat room give me a shout out that. Let me know when it's done. He made the moon also to serve in her season for a declaration of times and a sign of the world. From the moon is the sign of feasts, a light that decreaseth in her perfection. The moon is called after her name, increasing wonderfully in her changing, being an instrument of the armies above, shining in the firmament of heaven. The beauty of heaven, the glory of the stars, an ornament giving light in the highest place of the Lord. All right. Hopefully everything is good. Somebody let me know in the chat room whether you're able to hear me now, because I'm certainly not hearing the commercial breaks. Okay, good. Hey, I appreciate everybody joining us this evening. I'm going to be speaking about the festival, the Sabbath, and the Enochian calendar. And I want to touch upon a few things because there's still so much confusion out there with regard to this particular topic. And it's my opinion, it is important. We are commanded. Thank you, everyone. We are commanded to honor the Sabbath, and it is the fourth commandment of the 10, those that are the most important and which were given to Moses as the law, the 10 commandments that were written into stone by the finger of the Most High when Moses was brought up to the top of the firmament and received then the Torah. And it says especially in the Chronicles of Jeremiah and also in the Targum of Psalms and several other places, it specifies that when Moses went to the top of the mountain, that he was carried by a cloud up to the height of heights, to the heavenly temple, and that he was brought before the throne room of the Most High God, and that the angels were complaining about one being born of woman being allowed to enter into that realm. And Moses was frightened, but the Father was his advocate as well as the Word, and protected him and stood him up so that he wasn't fearful being in the presence of what were very large statured and glorious angels. And so it was afterwards in being in the presence of the Most High that when he descended back down to Mount Sinai and wandered amongst the people that they were very much afraid of him, because it showed in his face that he had, something supernatural had occurred to him with regard to meeting Yahuwah. And so it was also during the Exodus that this calendar was re-implemented, and that what had been the beginning of the year in the 7th month with Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, that was Rosh Hashanah, began the Hebrew New Year, that all of that was changed and returned back to what it had been, with a linear progression of the seasons, beginning with spring, summer, fall, and winter. And I also will bring up this evening a couple of passages that I recently discovered, which absolutely, without question, affirms that the lunar phases, the quarterly phases of the moon, are what determine Sabbath, and the links as far as the heavenly sign, the moon being a sign for festal times and for the holy days, specific holy days, and especially with regard to Sabbath, because if you consider all the things in the creation, the moon is the one thing which works and aligns with Sabbath as far as having 4 quarterly phases. And that, understanding the ancient Hebrew Enochian calendar, the way that it works and the way that it is determined, the way that it is set up, it is easy for anybody in any part of the world, no matter where you may be, in seeing and being witness to the moon in the heavens, that you can align with the way that the moon goes through a lunation, which is from waxing crescent, which is the first day of the lunar month, and it is excluded from the following 4 7-day counts of what are the work days, as well as the rest days, Sabbath being the rest day. That it is the sighting of the waxing crescent moon, the very thin sliver in the western skies following sunset after the lunar conjunction, when it first becomes visible, that determines the alignment of the lunar months. And every lunar month is the same. You have what is the time of the new moon, Kadesh, which marks the beginning of that month, and then you have 4 7-day sabbatical weeks, and at the very end, because the moon alternates between 29.531 day cycles, which is what's called the lunation, it alternates between 29 and 30 days. Most often, it's not always that way, but for the most part, it mostly alternates in such manner. And so I'm going to explain a few things with regard to how the cycle, the lunation of the moon, aligns with Sabbath, because the way that it works, it's not exactly precise. And so people have contacted me and with regard to the blue moon that just recently happened on January 31st, which was the blue moon is the second full moon of a month. And this was also a super moon, and it was also a lunar eclipse, all three that happened on the same particular day. And so, well, in the evening, the same particular night. And so individuals wanted to know if that was indeed the full moon as determined by, science and the measure of the percentages of a lunation, how it is that the Sabbath could occur either a day or 2 days after. And how that is and the way that it is determined and why that is because it is the waxing crescent and the first visibility of it, which usually it's going to be sighted anywhere from 24 to 72 hours after the lunar conjunctive moon, which is the dark phase of moon where the moon rises with the sun, crosses the skies with the sun, and then sets with the sun, and because of that is not visible and cannot be seen. And it is only when because every day the moon lags behind the sun by 50 minutes. And so when the moon lags enough to be sighted in the western skies after sunset as a very thin crescent, that is what is called Kadesh. And it's that day which marks the first night, the first day, the first night of the lunar calendar. And it's my opinion that the very next day is the first working day of the 6, which lead up to the first Sabbath, which always occurs on the 8th day of the lunar month. But there are individuals that believe and teach that when you sight the waxing crescent moon, that the very next day is new moon day. And then you begin the 6-day count, which I'm not in agreement with that. And the only reason being is because, in my opinion, if you throw in an extra day just for new moon day, that it significantly throws off the timing of the quarterly phases so that they are skewed more so than even the 24 hours that we see, that is the way that we have it set up on the Enochian calendar. And also I wanted to let everybody know that I will be making a new calendar beginning in March, because March in God's calendar, the month of Nisan or Abib, which Nisan comes from the word Nisim, which means miracles, that was the month of miracles for the Hebrews when they were freed from the bondage of slavery in Egypt. And it's also Abib, the month of Abib, as declared in Exodus chapter 12, that the Most High Yahweh Elohim tells them that this will be the first month for them. And Abib means green ears, and that's when the barley feast ripens, being the first winter crop to come to, for the Hebrews to actually be able to harvest and begin to utilize that. That is the first crop to ripen, and it is the first crop to be waved by the high priest on what is the day of first fruits, following the Sabbath of unleavened bread. And the festivals, the feast days, as aligned by and declared and mandated for our observation by the Hebrew people in Leviticus chapter 23, you see that there are there's spring feasts, the Passover, Pesach, and the Day of Unleavened Bread, which is on the Sabbath, the 15th of Nisan. And then you have the Day of First Fruits occurring the morrow after the Sabbath. And that is when they bring in the offering of the barley for the barley festival. And you have a 7-day festival beginning with the Sabbath of the 15th and ending with the Sabbath of the 22nd. And the only way that those 2 days can remain a Sabbath consistently year in and year out is if you are determining the passing of time according to the ancient Enochian lunar solar calendar, as we've laid it out in the one that we've made and have released through Sacred Word Publishing. But also I'd like to say that you can make that calendar specific because I made it for residents of the East Coast of the United States of America. That the way that it is aligned and the way that the new moons and the Sabbaths and the feast days are laid out according to the Gregorian calendar, which we overlaid upon, that you can determine and you can shift it however you need according to where you might be, especially for those that are in southern latitudes or in different parts of the world, for instance, like China or Australia or some other part of the circle of the earth, that all you have to do is cite where when the waxing crescent is sighted in your skies and then adjust it accordingly. That if it's 1 day off for you or however, that you can just shift everything by that amount of time by determining when the occurrence of new moon happens for you in the area where you are as far as the face of the earth. Now, one of my good friends, Diane Colver, who wrote the book Yahweh's Timepiece Explained, which we've released through Sacred Word Publishing, and she does a fantastic job on her research and the information that she's brought forth in that particular book on the calendar and its connections to feast days and so on and so forth. This is one of the aspects that we differentiate upon, and she believes that no matter where you are on the face of the earth, that you should determine your Kadesh according to what happens in Israel. And in my opinion, we are all to determine locally where and when Kadesh occurs, and then align Sabbath and the feast days accordingly. And then the other thing where we diverge upon is that she feels, excuse me, she feels that there should be a new moon day following the sighting of the waxing crescent moon as the time of the new moon as Kadesh, whereas I don't, because I fill that to include the new moon day, you will skew the sighting of the quarterly phases so that it would be difficult to determine if you didn't have a written down calendar that all of us should be able to determine by the sighting of particular phases of the moon that those should always align with Sabbath. And I know that it's going to be slightly off the first quarter moon, the full moon, and the third quarter moon, that it will be slightly off according to the determination of Kadesh with the alignment. But for the most part, if you do count Kadesh from the very first sliver of the sighting of the quote waxing crescent moon, it aligns pretty close. For instance, the full moon will always be on the eve of the 15th, as is cited in a couple of the passages that I will relate and share with you very soon. And I will share many other confirming witnesses which show that the ancient Hebrew and the ancient Christians, the very first and early establishment of the church, that they did determine Sabbath by the lunar phases and not according to the Gregorian or the Julian solar calendar and a 7-day progression, unbroken progression of months and years. And and the reason why people are at a loss as to the timing of Sabbath now is because the Gregorian solar calendar, which most of the world utilizes, does not take into account exclusion for Kadesh as the first day of the lunar month and is excluded from the other 4 7-day sabbatical weeks, which are dependent upon that determination. And so in every lunar month, you have the first day, which is the waxing crescent, and that is not counted in any of these 7-day weeks, which occur after the sighting of Kadesh. And so that day is excluded and held alone and stands alone. And it is a holy convocation in that the new moons were to be celebrated, not in the same manner as Sabbath, but they were a high holy day. And so that day stood alone, and then you would have the 6 working days and the first Sabbath aligned to the first quarter moon, then 6 more working days and the second Sabbath, which always occurred on the 15th of the lunar month, and that would be aligned with the full moon, closely to the full moon, and then 6 more working days and the third quarter Sabbath, which was always occurred on the 22nd of the month, and then 6 more working days, and then the fourth Sabbath, the lunar conjunctive Sabbath, where the moon was not be sighted and could not be seen. And then you would have either the new moon as the very next day or a 30-day translation day, and then the sighting of the new moon in the following day. And there was never more than 30 days in any lunar month, as the phases of the moon go through a 29.5314 lunation period. And so, as I said earlier, they alternate between 29 and 30 days and never go past 30 days. And for those that don't know or don't believe that the lunar calendar is the calendar of the Bible and that is taught about in the Bible and that is affirmed as the biblical calendar, not only um, given to Moses and reestablished with the Exodus, but it was also the one given to Adam and Eve and to Abraham and others. And that, as I covered in a show previously, that these feast days, these holy festival days, as mandated in Leviticus 23, that they were not just random and they didn't just come about because of the Exodus. These holy days were celebrated and honored going all the way back, even before the creation of Adam and Eve and their being cast out of paradise and banished here to the earth. That even the casting out of Adam occurred on the Feast of Trumpets. And it was, the Day of Atonement. It was all of that was aligned with also with his repentance and forgiveness. And the festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, weeks, all of that. And Nisan, the Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost or Shavuot, all of those were holy days that were celebrated going all the way back in time before the fall of humanity. And as I showed from a book called The Legends of the Patriarchs and the Prophets, it tells us that even Abraham, that he received, that he was going to offer Isaac as the Passover, just like Christ, just like God offered his only begotten son, thousands of years later, 1948 years later, which I think it's interesting that Abraham was born in 1948 BC, which, that again aligns with the fact that Israel became a nation in 1948 AD. I mean, all these numbers and all these different, the feast days and the festivals, they all align with historical significance, the blood red moons, different things like that. That even Christ, it is believed that he was born either on the Feast of Trumpets or the Feast of Tabernacles. I actually believe it's the Feast of Trumpets, and the reason I say that is because Adam was banished from paradise on that particular day. And so it would make sense to me that Christ would come into and enter in this time space dimensionality to redeem him on exactly the same day and according to the same festival which had been celebrated. And that this will also be the day that he returns for his second advent, that it will be on the Feast of Trumpets, and that it will be when the archangel brings forth as the seventh trumpet the blast of the ram's horn, and then the kingdoms of this world are determined to be the kingdoms of our Lord, and that that the fulfillment, and then his taking the judgment seat, that how that will align with the Day of Atonement, that just as Adam and Eve were forgiven, um, Christ will also bring every knee to bow and every tongue to confess that all the dead will be resurrected and all will be judged. And those that are worthy shall go forth to enter into the New Jerusalem, where they will reign with him for this 1,000 years. The millennial reign will be the Sabbath rest, the 6,000 years, the 120 jubilees of the Second World Age, which 120 times 50, that's 6,000 years, and then you have the 1,000 years of the millennial reign, equaling the day of rest. And then it is the after the millennial reign that the 7,000 years are completed for what is the duality of this life and this particular our way of being. And so, again, all of these things line up. And so I do recommend people check out the legends of the patriarchs and the prophets, and you'll see over and over again the different occurrences of these Levitical holy days as they play out in the lives of other patriarchs and other prophets. And I'll when we go to the break, I'll see if I can find my notes on that so I can share with you some of that. But I did do a show, and I don't remember the name of it, but what I'll do is I will set up a playlist for all of the shows that are linked to the Enochian calendar so that people can find them quickly and you can listen to all of this information to get, again, a better understanding as to how this calendar is biblical and how it also ties into the Exodus, which I did do a show a few years back about how this calendar was restored during the Exodus. And it's only by understanding how this calendar works that the details of the Exodus and the fact that they were that Passover occurred right before the Sabbath of unleavened bread. And then because Sabbath is celebrated only from sunrise to sunset, that following sunset, the night of the 15th, that the Israelites were allowed to travel and then wandered out of the bondage of Egypt and later being pursued thereafter, that the destruction of the Egyptians took place soon thereafter. And that once they were freed from, the slavery and their internment within Egypt, they were then taken to the wilderness and they met God face to face on 40 days after, on what is the 9th of Sivan. And it was after the passing of 7 perfect sabbatical weeks, that after the 15th, after the 8th of Sivan, that being the 7th Sabbath, or the 49 7-day sabbatical weeks, that the 50th day, Pentecost, or Shavuot, always occurs on the 9th of Sivan. And so, according to the life of Christ, that was when the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles, 40 days after, his passing, his resurrection, and when he ascended up to the right hand of his Father. And so all of those feasts and all of those festivals were, occurred in similarity. That just as Yahweh had freed the Israelites and the children of Adam from the bondage of Egypt, so did Christ descend down into Sheol and free them from the bondage of being kept captive in Abraham's bosom. And so, again, the connections are miraculous, really. Just like the reason why the month of Nisan is known as the month of miracles, which we'll talk about that also, how it is that, the Gregorian calendar, we determine and name all of our days by pagan deities. The sun god for Sunday, the moon god for Monday. Tuia, the Norse god Tuia for Tuesday. All these different pagan names. Thor's Day, Woden's Day, Freya's Day, and Saturn's Day. So all of those things. But in the original Hebrew, they were simply numbered, called the first through the seventh day being the Sabbath. And then the months were also that way as well. But we'll talk about those names when we get back as well. But I want to share with you really quickly why it is and how it is that I know without a doubt that the lunar calendar is the one that was celebrated. And you can determine that by going to Joshua chapter 6, which I will bring forth in story here. And so if anybody ever asks you how you know that the lunar calendar is the calendar of Yah and the one that we should be following, you can go to this story in Joshua chapter 6, which only makes sense if it is in fact a lunar calendar that the Hebrews are following, because otherwise the Most High would be breaking his Sabbath, which, that would never happen. He would never mandate for us to honor the Sabbath and then break it himself. That just would not in any manner make any sense. And so in Joshua chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord saith unto Joshua, See, I have given into thy hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. And so he tells them to march 7 days. And, again, unless you are following a lunar calendar and you include Kadesh as one of the 7 days, then, if we're on a Gregorian solar calendar, there's no way, because every once in 7 days is a Sabbath, according to the never ending, unbroken months and years, according to that calendar, that there could never be a 7 day period where one is not breaking Kadesh or marching on Kadesh, or where the Most High God is breaking his own commandment. But again, when you understand that the lunar calendar is the calendar which the Hebrew people utilized even during the Exodus, that then it makes sense that how it is that they could march for 7 days. And then after the seventh day, when the city is taken, that the following day was Sabbath. It was the 8th. It was the 8th of that particular month. And it was on the 8th that they rested after taking the city. And so, again, in my opinion, when you understand this story and its connections to the lunar calendar, then it totally makes sense as to how this story affirms and also aligns with what we are bringing forth in explanation here. And again, you'll see that in the celebration, the spring feast, these 7 days, that you begin with the 15th of Nisan, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it continues to the 22nd, that is the third quarter Sabbath moon. And so it's a Sabbath to Sabbath festival. And again, because the Gregorian doesn't take into account exclusion for Kadesh, the Sabbath, or the 7 day periods, they run together. And it's not every month that you have the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th aligning with Sabbath as you do on the lunar calendar. And so, reading and studying the Bible, you'll see that it often tells you that it is on the 15th that these festivals, these holy days, are to be celebrated. And as they were by Solomon and David and the other patriarchs, as mentioned all throughout the biblical narrative, and even in Philo's time, and also in Enoch, even in as I will share with you shortly, Enoch and Ezekiel, that they also share passages where they align the phases of the moon to the celebration of these feast days, which again, in my opinion, is the correct way to honor and to observe them. Which we'll go to that now. Let me find that really quickly. Because it was just recently that I discovered these two passages, and I wanted to share them with individuals that have never heard this. All right. The first one is from a pseudepigraphal text called Ezekiel the Tragedian. And in it says, "This month shall be the first month of your year, in which I'll lead you to another land, which to the Hebrew fathers I did swear, and say to all the peoples, in this month, on full moon's eve, the paschal sacrifice to God present, and touch the doors with blood, which sign the fearsome angel shall pass by." And so again, here you have the full moon aligned with the paschal sacrifice, which is again Passover, occurring on the 14th of Nisan. And so, touch the doors with blood, which sign the fearsome angel shall pass by. And so it was on midnight, the 14th of Nisan, that the angel of the Lord went across Egypt and slew all the firstborn. And if you read carefully the story of Exodus in chapter 12 and 13, you see that Moses is summoned by Pharaoh shortly thereafter, after the passing of the angel of death and after the wailing and the cries of the Egyptians, and that discovering his own child dead, Pharaoh calls for Aaron and Moses and tells them to leave, to gather up all their belongings and to leave. And so on that morning, he goes back, and then they celebrate Passover. They eat during that night, and then for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they consume the rest of the lamb, and then the rest is offered up as burnt offering, because it would be the night of the 15th. Because again, it's only during the day, sunrise to sunset, that Sabbath is celebrated. And then it was on the night of the 15th, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Sabbath of Unleavened Bread, that the people marched out of Egypt under a full moon night. Which, I mean, what better night for them to leave than under a full moon, where they could see everything. And so, talk about silent night and holy night. I mean, and here again in this verse, you have, without a question, in this month, on full moon's eve, the paschal sacrifice to God present, and touch the doors with blood, with sign of the fearsome angel shall pass by. And so no question that every Passover, when the sacrifice is to take place, that is the full moon, the second full moon Sabbath of every lunar month. And it can only be on a full moon that, according to the lunar calendar, that this can then make sense. I'm going to share with you one other passage, which even though I had read it many times, I discovered it. It popped out to me. Let me find it here. And this is in the third book of Enoch. And I just released it as part of a note. All right, here it says in chapter 17, verse 5. Under them is Ophaniel, the prince who is set over the globe of the moon. And with him are 88 angels who move the globe of the moon, 354,000 parasangs every night at the time when the moon stands in the east at its turning point. And when is the moon sitting in the east at its turning point? Answer: in the 15th day of every month. And so here Enoch is telling you that on the full moon, when the moon begins to turn from light to dark and begins to wane, that the full moon is always associated and tied with the 15th day of every month. And so, without a doubt, Enoch is telling you that the calendar which the Hebrews and the Israelites acknowledged was a lunar calendar. Again, because it's only by observing a lunar calendar and marking the passing of Sabbath, Sabbath, with the phases of the moon, the quarterly phases of the moon, that the full moon is equated with the 15th day of every month. Because as I said, in every lunar month, the first day is Kadesh, and then you have the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, which are Sabbath. All right, we'll be right back.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for the second hour. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and I'm speaking about the Enochian calendar and how one can utilize it for the determination of when Sabbath occurs, as well as the Levitical feast days. And in my opinion, it is only by utilizing this calendar that one can, in fact, do so. And so I'm going to share with the listening audience some passages and some quotes which affirm this as truth to help people to make sense of why it is they should look into this particular issue and consider it with regard to its connections to Sabbath. Because again, unless you are following the correct calendar and the dynamics of that calendar, one can never really determine the occurrence of a specific day or how to observe the holy days that were mandated by the Most High God according to what is now a lost calendar system that ever since we have taken on and been led astray by the counterfeit systems established by Satan, the adversary, to hide, to confuse, and to distort what are the correct feast days and the holidays. One would not even know that one is involved in idolatry, or that one is deceived, and that one is caught up in deception. And that's the way of it, that most of the world, because they are ignorant to these dynamics and have no comprehension as to when the deceit was brought on. And, this is before their lifetime. This is before our lifetime. So all we've known is deception. We've been indoctrinated into a belief system, into a reality, which from the moment that you're born, you are led astray. And nobody is given correct understanding. Nobody is being given the truth. And so, unless you realize at some point that the control mechanism, the matrix that you are born into, has lied to you, whether purposely or not, in my opinion, purposely for sure. But whether you are a willing or an unwilling adherent to that deception doesn't matter. What matters is that everybody is indoctrinated into a false illusion of what is truth. And so, unless you come to understand that, just like with 9/11, that government sponsored terror and that they fund the boogeymen and they bring forth the terrorists as a pretext to then crack down on them, and that the illusion of choice and the illusion of the good guy and the bad guy, that it's all a sham, you can never make sense of why it is that the terrorists are protected and how it is that the government agencies that are supposed to crack down on the bad guys do otherwise but support them and arm them and assist them in breaking the law. I mean, just recently I saw a movie called American Made, where Tom Cruise, he plays this guy named Barry Seals, who had been working with the CIA, not only funding the Contras and taking arms to them, but bringing flying drugs in and doing all kind of things that were criminal. But he was doing it for the agency until they decided to burn him. And that's what led to his death. He had to basically roll over on those people that he was involved with in breaking the law, that he no longer had the protection. And that's largely the way that it is, that a lot of agents are protected and utilized and given cover until they are no longer needed. And they're all expendable. And a lot of times, even the directors, like different individuals, they also meet very strange and precarious deaths. William Colby, there's been lots of people, but anyways, that's just an example. And the fact that movies like that come out and nothing is ever said, and and there's nothing ever brought up about it, shows just how complacent America has become with regard to the government breaking the law and then boasting, parading it in front of us. The lies and deceit of NASA and all the money that they are collecting yearly in their budgets. I mean, oh my gosh, if that's not high crimes and treason, I don't know what is. All right, so I'm gonna go to some quotes, and this is part of the research that was done by one of our artists, authors, Diane Colver, in her book Yahweh's Timepiece Explained, which is really an excellent book. She does incredible research, and really I thank her for having done so, because it keeps me from having to write that book, even though I will write again soon as part of one of the books that I release shortly, cover the calendar in aspect and detail it in manner that I haven't, besides in the Flat Earth as Key to Decrypt the Book of Enoch book, that I'll share some of my new research and some of my new discoveries on this, such as those two quotes that I shared with you in the first hour. But all right, confirming again, for those that may be new to this topic, the week, connections with the lunar phases. A division of time comprising 7 days, thus explaining the Hebrew name. There are indications of the use of another system of reckoning time, in which the month was divided into 3 parts of 10 days each, the decade being designated in Hebrew by the term asor. This apparently represented 1/3 of the solar month, while the week of 7 days was connected with the lunar month, of which it is approximately a fourth. The quadripartite division of the month was evidently in use among the Hebrews and other ancient peoples, but it is not clear whether it originated among the former. It is unnecessary to assume, however, that it was derived from the Babylonians, for it is equally possible that observations of the 4 phases of the moon led the Hebrew nomads spontaneously and independently to devise the system of dividing the interval between the successive new moons into 4 groups of 7 days each. There is ground, on the other hand, for the assumption that both among the Babylonians and among the Hebrews, the first day of the first week of the month was always reckoned as coincident with the first day of the month. The emphasis laid on the requirement that the weeks of Pentecost should be complete, terminate, suggests that weeks might be reckoned in such way as to validate this injunction. This was the case as long as the first day of the first week of the month was made to coincide with the new moon. At the end of 4 weeks, an interval of 1 or 2 days might intervene before the new week could begin. At an early date, however, this intimate connection between the week and the moon must have been dissolved. The chief cause of the fixed week of 7 days being, in all probability, the predominance of the 7th day as the Sabbath. The week thus became a useful standard in the measurement of intervals of time, 1 week 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 7 weeks, as in, there's all these different passages which relate to that. Now, let me make, again, with regard to perfect weeks and 7 perfect weeks, because we are told in Leviticus, as far as the counting of the Omer, to keep up with the passing of 7 perfect weeks in order to determine the 49-day festival, the Feast of Weeks, which are 7 perfect weeks, and then the day after that 7th Sabbath is the 50th day. That the only way you can count 7 perfect weeks and to maintain these same the dates is by doing so according to the lunar calendar. And in counting the Omer and also counting the 7 perfect weeks, one must exclude from that count the occurrence of Kadesh and also translation days, because those 7 weeks, beginning with the 16th of Nisan, they span over the fullness of 2 months, the beginning of 2 Kadeshes, and over the course of the at least 1 translation day. And so there is included in that 7-day or 7 perfect week count 3 extra days, 2 Kadeshes and 1 translation day. But again, those are excluded, and you are only counting according to the quarterly phases of the moon. And so the 15th of Nisan, which is a Sabbath, it is on the 16th of Nisan, the first day of the week. And then you have the Sabbath, the 3rd quarter Sabbath of the 22nd of Nisan as the first week. The second Sabbath, which is the 4th quarter, the lunar conjunctive Sabbath, the 29th day of Nisan. And then if that is a 30-day week, you have a translation day. And then you have Kadesh, which those 2 days are excluded from the counting of the Omer. And then you have, after Kadesh, then again the counting of another perfect week. And you have on the 8th of Iyar. Let me make sure. Don't want to tell you incorrectly. But on the the month of Iyar. So you would have on the 8th of Iyar, the 1st quarter Sabbath, the 15th of Iyar, the full moon Sabbath, which would be the 28th day of the Omer. And then you'd have the 3rd quarter Sabbath on the 22nd of Iyar. And then that would be the 34th day of the Omer. And then on the 29th of Iyar, which is the lunar conjunctive Sabbath, you would have the 34th day of the counting of the Omer. And then on the 8th of Sivan, the 1st quarter Sabbath, you would have the 49th day of the Omer. And then you would have on the 50th day, which is always the day after the 8th of Sivan. So it's always on the 9th of Sivan that you have Shavuot. Okay. And so that's always how you determine the Omer. And it's always on the, as I said, the 7 perfect weeks that you have the passing going to Shavuot. All right, continuing with some of these quotes because we're quickly running out of time. The calendar, its lunar origin. The Sabbath, depending in Israel's nomadic period upon the observation of the phases of the moon, it could not, according to this view, be a fixed day. When the Israelites settled in the land and became farmers, their new life would have made it desirable that the Sabbath should come at regular intervals, and the desired change would have been made easily as they had abandoned the lunar religion. The moon was the beneficent deity of the shepherds in the region and climate where ancient Israel had its ancestral home. Hence, the many races of lunar institutions and even the latest Israelitist cult and its phraseology. The horn crescent, the face of Yahweh in the benedictions. The Sabbath as marking the end of the week reveals its lunar origin. The phases of the moon having taught the shepherds whose weal or two depended so largely upon the benevolence or the malevolence of the night season to divide the period elapsing between two new moons into 4 equal groups of weeks, the last day of each in imitation of the moon's coming to rest, as it were, or becoming the days of rest. Indications are not wanting that at first the new moon festival was not counted among the 7 days of the week, but after 7 times 4, 28 days had elapsed, 1 or 2 days were intercalculated as new moon days, whereupon a new cycle of 4 weeks began, so that the Sabbath was a movable festival. Later, the week and the Sabbath became fixed, and this gradually resulted in taking away from the new moon festivals its popular importance. Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, 1943. Page 410. Holidays. Sabbath and new moon, Rosh Chodesh, both periodically recurring in the course of the year. The new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was, dependent upon the lunar cycle. Both date back to the nomadic period of Israel. Originally, the new moon was celebrated in the same way as the Sabbath. Gradually, it became less important, while the Sabbath became more and more a day of religion and humanity, of religious meditation and instruction, or peace and delight of the soul, and produced powerful and beneficent effects outside of Judaism. Page 482 on the week. Continuing. Shabbat, or weekly Sabbath, originally arose from the lunar cycle, containing 4 weeks ending in Sabbath, plus 1 or 2 additional in unreckoned days per lunar month. While the development of the importance of the Sabbath as a day of consecration and the emphasis laid upon the significant number 7, the week became more and more divorced from its lunar connection. Page 171 on the new moon. However, in the diaspora, the new moon came to occupy a secondary position in contrast to a so-called Saturday Sabbath. The prohibition against work and the carrying on of commerce was lifted, and the new moon, although still celebrated by means of increased offerings, soon was reduced to the rank of a minor of half holiday. The importance of sighting a new moon crescent was confined to the fact that it remained of great value and necessity for the fixing of the festivals. Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, 1908. The Jewish Calendar, page 117. The Asuan Papyri yield ample proof of the fact that at the time after the exile, no such fixed week cycle was in use among the Jews. The Popular and Critical Bible Encyclopedia, Volume 3, page 1497, 1904 edition. It is powerfully urged by the believers in a primitive Sabbath that we find from time immemorial the knowledge of a week of 7 days among all nations, Egyptians, Arabians, Indians. In a word, all the nations of the East have in all ages made use of this week of 7 days, for which it is difficult to account without admitting that this knowledge was derived from the common ancestors, Adam and Eve of the human race. Among all, divided in 4 weeks, corresponding to the phases of the quarters of the moon. In order to connect the reckoning by weeks with the lunar month, we find that all ancient nations observed some peculiar solemnities to mark the day of the new moon. The new Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, Volume 10, page 135. The association of Sabbath rest with the account of creation must have been very ancient among the Hebrews, and it is noteworthy that no other Semitic peoples, even the Babylonians, have any tradition of the creation in 6 days. It would appear that the primitive Semitics had 4 chief moon days, probably the 1st, 8th, 15th, and 22nd of each month, called Sabbaths from the fact that there was a tendency to end work before then so that they might be celebrated joyfully. Encyclopedia Biblica, page 705 on the week. This quadruped division of the month into weeks was naturally suggested by the phases of the moon and was far from being peculiar to the Hebrews. By dividing the first 28 days of each month into 4 weeks, terminating respectively on the 7th, 14th, 21st, 28th days, and by making the first week of the new moon always begin with the new moon, this intimate connection, however, between the week and the month was soon dissolved. Page 131 on the Sabbath. These facts make it safe to reject one often repeated explanation of the Sabbath, that it was in its origin what it is in the astrological week, the days sacred to Saturn. In fact, the 4 quarters of the moon supply an obvious division of the month, of celebrating a Sabbath every 7th day, irrespective of the relationship of the day to the moon's phases, led to a complete separation from the ancient view of the Sabbath. Page 432 on the stars. This is from the same book. The Hebrew month is a lunar month, and the quarter of this period, one phase of the moon, appears to have determined the week of 7 days. Encyclopedia Britannica. We note that in the worship of Yahweh, the sacred seasons of the new moon and the Sabbath are obviously lunar. Scribner's Dictionary of the Bible, 1989, page 521. In the time of the earliest prophets, the new moon stood in the same line with another lunar observance, the Sabbath. Sabbath, 1909 edition, page 807. In the prophetic and historical books, Sabbath and the new moon are associated in such a way as to suggest that both were lunar festivals. Time, 1909 edition, page 936. The next obvious division of time would be the month. The phases of the moon would be watched, and it would soon be noticed that these reoccurred of regular intervals. Given this period of 28 days, together with the recurrent phases of the moon, it would naturally be subdivided like the day itself into 4 divisions of weeks of 7 days each. Hillel II. patriarch, son, and successor of Judah III, tradition ascribes to him an enactment which proved of an incalculable benefit to his co-religious of his own and of subsequent generations, to equalize the lunar with the solar year, and then by render possible the universal celebration of the festivals on the days designated in the Bible. Occasional intercalations of a day in a month and of a month in a year were required. During the persecution under Hadrian and in the time of his successor, Antonius Pius, the martyr Rabbi Akiba and his pupils attempted to lay down rules for the intercalation of a month. Under the patriarch of Simon III, 140 to 163, a great quarrel arose concerning the feast days and the leap year, which threatened to cause a permanent schism between the Babylonian and the Palestinian communities. A result was only averted by the exercise of much diplomacy. In 325, the Council of Nicaea was held, and by that time the equinox had retrograded to March 21st. This council made no practical change in the existing civil calendar, but addressed itself to the reform of the church calendar, which was solely lunar on the Jewish system. Great disputes had arisen as to the time of celebrating Easter. Moreover, the church was not fully established, many Christians being still simply Jewish sectarians. A new rule was therefore made which, while still keeping Easter dependent on the moon, prevented it from coinciding with Passover. The persecutions under Constantius finally decided the patriarch Hillel II in 330 to 336, 330 to 365, to publish rules for the computation of the calendar, which had heretofore been regarded as a secret science. And so it was then, during that time, that the Sabbath was fixed to 1 in every 7 days. Babylonian Menologues and the Semitic calendar, page 89. The weeks do not continue in a regular cycle regardless of the moon. Each month has 4 weeks, the beginning with the new moon. I have no doubt that this was the old Hebrew system. Rest Days by Houghton Webster. In the year 1869, the late George Smith, well known as a pioneer student of Assyriology, discovered among the cuneiform tablets in the British Museum a curious religious calendar of the Assyrians, in which every month is divided into 4 weeks of 7 days, or Sabbaths, are marked out as days on which no work should be undertaken. 6 years afterwards, Sir Henry Rawdon published this calendar in the 4th volume of his standard collection of cuneiform inscriptions. It appears to be a transcript of a much more ancient Babylonian original, possibly belonging to the age of Hammurabi, 1792 to 1750 BC, which had been made by the order of Ashurbanipal and placed in his royal library at Nineveh. It has been held in the first place that the evil days were selected corresponding to the moon's successive changes. Hence, that the 7th day marks the close of the earliest form of the 7th-day week, a week bound up with the lunar phases. According to another opinion, the setting apart of every 7th day was due to the importance ascribed to 7. Hence, that the 7-day cycle were not regarded as quarters of the lunation, but rather as periods containing the symbolic number of 7 days, which happened to coincide roughly with the 4th part of the lunar month. The second view would be merely an amplification of the first, if we assume, with perhaps the majority of the Assyriologists, that the role of 7 as a symbolic number is ultimately connected with the moon changing her phases and intervals every approximately 7 days. The lunar calendars and the week. The early Christians had at first adopted the Jewish 7-day week with its numbered weekdays. But by the close of the 3rd century AD, this began to give way to the planetary week, and in the 4th and 5th centuries, the pagan designations became generally accepted in the western half of Christendom. During these same centuries, the spread of Oriental solar worships, especially that of Mithra, in the Roman world had already led to the substitution by pagans of Dies Solis for Dies Saturni as the first day of the planetary week. And Constantine's famous edict, as we have seen, definitely enrolled Sunday among the holidays of the Roman state religion. The Hebrew Sabbath. But the problem is simplified if we hold that the Hebrews employed lunar 7-day weeks, perhaps for 7 centuries preceding the exile, weeks that is, which ended with special observances on the 7th day, but nonetheless were tied to the moon's course. The establishment of a periodic week ending in a Sabbath observed every 7th day was doubtless responsible for the gradual obsolescence of the new moon festival as a period of general abstinence, while with continuous weeks, the new moon day and the Sabbath day would from time to time coincide. As we have said and as we have shared, when they divorced Sabbath from the lunar phases, they basically made Sabbath one in every 7 days, which made the Sabbath to the real Sabbath to occur on any of the 7 days of the week. And so Sabbath could occur on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, or on the new moon day, which never happened before such divorcement was made official. And the Gregorian solar calendar and the cycling of Sabbath once in every 7 days was made official. Shavuot Sabbath, ancient Sabbath observance. Most theologians and some scholars assume that mainstream Jewish society at the time of Jesus was practicing a fixed 7-day week, which was the same as the modern fixed cycling planetary designations of 7-day week. This is extremely doubtful. The change from a lunar to a fixed week was brought around by the power and influence of Rome. As long as the Nazarenes held power in Jerusalem, all Roman practices and customs, including that of the consecutive week, were held at bay. Early historical records clearly confirm that very early Gentile Christians also kept the same Sabbath as the Nazarenes. This practice was first changed by Pope Sixtus in 126 AD, and later officially changed by a Roman royal decree from the Emperor Constantine. Observance of the Sabbath day was made illegal, and observance of a Sunday of a fixed cycling planetary designated week was made mandatory for all except farmers. Previous to this time, the Roman Saturday was the first day of the Roman week. The veneration of the sun in the 2nd century AD began to pressure Roman culture to change the first day of their week from Saturn Day to Sunday. The Mishnah, Rosh Hashanah. On the occasion of 2 new moons, witness to the new moon violate the prohibitions of the Sabbath at Nisan and at Tishri, for on these occasions the messengers go forth to Syria. And on them they determine the set feasts. And when the temple stood, they violate the prohibitions of the Sabbath on the occasion of all the months, because of the determination of the offering for the celebration of the new month. Clement, Book 4, Chapter 16. Stromata. In periods of 7 days, the moon undergoes its changes. At the end of the first week, she becomes half moon. At the end of the second week, full moon. And at the end of the third week, in her wane, again half moon. And at the end of the fourth week, she disappears. So, that's another confirming witness to the fact that the full moon always aligns to the second lunar week. Emil Schur, The Jewish People in the Time of Jesus Christ, page 366. But unless all indications are deceitful, they, the Jews, did not in the time of Yeshua, Messiah, possess as yet any fixed calendar, but on the basis of purely empirical observation, on each occasion they began a new month with the appearing of the new moon, the waxing crescent. Theodore Gilman, 1916, page 479. The changes in the calendric position of the weekly religious rest days have been few from prehistoric times to the present day. The Sabbath, which came down to the Jews from prehistoric prior to Moses' times, was the 7th day of the lunar week. The lunar week and the lunar month gave the simplest form of time division to early man. Moon and month meant the same thing. The division of the month into 4 weeks and 7 days left the so-called epagomenal days, which had to be neglected, and the weekly division begun again at the time of the next new month, or new moon. The change from the lunar week to the 7-day week, running continuously through the year, while a momentous change was unrecorded. The use of 2 styles of week seemed to have existed together, and the more modern 7-day week slowly but finally supplanting its ancient but inexact competitor. The lunar week was simple and serviceable. When the continuous 7-day week was generally accepted, then it was linked with the past, as we now date events before Christ by a scale unknown to the people and historians of those times. The lunar Sabbath was succeeded by the 7-day weekly Sabbath without confusion, and the mention of the Sabbath in Exodus 31:13 and elsewhere may be taken to refer to the lunar days. Sunday, the world's rest day, the Sabbath, the day which divine love established and human love must preserve. Published for the New York Sabbath Committee, Doubleday, Page and Company, New York. Dr. Julian Oberman, the Jewish professor of Semitic languages at Yale University. Quote, the plain fact is that, as seen by recent scholars, the system of the fixed calendar was not developed until fully 3 to 4 centuries after the close of the Talmudic period, about AD 485. Nor can anything be found in the Talmud about such weighty calendric matters as the 4 post-moments, the 19-year cycle. Above all, there is nothing known in the old sources about starting points of calendric computations. The Encyclopedia Judica adds, also the four Dihayat rules of postponement developed gradually, nothing that the general acceptance of one of the four rules is not earlier than the 10th century. Jewish Theological Seminary of America, letter to Louis Finkelstein. The present Jewish calendar was fixed continuously weekly cycle in the 4th century. James Dwyer. Advanced Astronomy in Biblical Texts. A new look at the Christian Sabbath. The early Christian descriptions of a weekly cycle containing periodic single days are very clear, and this information, coupled with evidence provided by the measurable lunar-solar phenomena, strongly indicates that early Christians were practicing a lunar-based calendar. Page 42. It now seems almost certain that some additional definitions of the early Sabbath cycle are missing from the modern tradition of the 7-day week. Essentially, the modern week as a continuous cycle of 7 days does not seem to equate to the definition of the week as it was used during the early Christian era. This new research looks at the Sabbath calendar as it would have been known to the mainstream Jew, living in the 2nd century Temple era, and it finds the Sabbath to have been a rather sophisticated interface with the lunar solar system. In this earlier time, the Sabbath cycle, surprisingly, was defined by the phases of the moon, and even more surprising than this, the Sabbath cycle also revolved into precise alignment with the annual feast circuit. Herschel Shanks. Just a few more minutes and then I'll end with commentary. Biblical Archaeology Society. There were very marked differences in the attitude towards government and the preservation of Jewish religion and life between the Palestinian and Babylonian Jews. The Palestinian Jews jealously guarded their religion and way of life, while the Babylonian Jews were clearly willing to accommodate the government of their era and compromise certain principles that they held. This included the Sabbath day. During this time, a major revival of the Zoroastrian religion took place in 226 AD, when the first Sassanian king, Ardashir, came to the Persian throne. He made reforms to the old lunar-based calendar which had a far-reaching effect on his people, especially the Jews who initially rejected his new calendar, since it affected their religious observances. This resulted for a while in two calendars, one decreed by the king and the other, an older one, followed by the majority of the people in the kingdom. Eventually, however, the new calendar won out, and the Persians, as well as the Jews of Babylon, began to organize their Sabbaths according to the new solar calendar. Patrick Madrid, Roman Catholic scholar and apologist, January 5th, 2006. What your brother-in-law may not understand is that the Catholic Church did not change that commandment. The Catholic Church observes the commandment to keep holy the Sabbath, but it does so on the Lord's day. And the earliest Christians transferred their observance of that commandment from Saturday to Sunday. First of all, because there was a distinct break between the Old Testament requirements, and they wanted to show that Christianity was distinct from Judaism. It came from Judaism, but was distinct from it. celebrating the Lord's coming, celebrating the Lord's resurrection and death on the day that he rose from the dead seem to be the most appropriate. The other thing that we should remember too is that our calendar that we follow, including Seventh-day Adventists, is not only a calendar that was devised by the Catholic Church, but also is a calendar that's based upon the solar year, not the lunar year. And the Jewish calendar that was observed in the time of Christ follows a lunar calendar, which is several days short of the solar calendar. So the great irony is that even the Seventh-day Adventists themselves are not worshiping on exactly the same Sabbath day as the Jews of the time of Christ, because it's severed several days off now, and having switched to following the lunar calendar. So you can see, I mean, even the well-studied, Catholics, they know that the calendar that they follow is pagan, and that the calendar that the ancient Christians followed was the lunar, solar. All right, one more quote here. Iwatur Zerubbabel, the 7-day circle. Quasi-lunar weeks and continuous weeks actually represent two fundamentally distinct nodes of temporal organization of human life, the former involving partial adaptation to nature, and the latter stressing total emancipation from it. The invention of the continuous week was therefore one of the most significant breakthroughs in human beings' attempts to break away from being prisoners of nature, or of being, harmonizing with nature, and from under God's law, and create a social world of their own. That obviously involved disassociating the week from nature and its rhythms. Only by being based on an entirely artificial mathematical rhythm could the Sabbath observance become totally independent of the lunar or any other natural cycles. I mean, if this isn't clear to you that the lunar calendar was the official and the calendar which was utilized by early Christians, I mean, there are pages and pages more of quotes. And I just shared with you, I don't know, 20 at least? And so I do recommend that people check out Diane Colver's book, Yahweh's Timepiece Explained. You can find it at sacredwordpublishing.net. As I said, the only variances that I have with her with regard to the lunar calendar is that I believe that when the Kodesh, when the new moon is sighted, that the very next day begins the 6 working days leading up to the 7th day, which is the first Sabbath on the 8th day of the lunar month, whereas she believes that there's a new moon day to be celebrated between the sighting of Kadesh and the beginning of the 6 working days. And the only other thing is that I believe that we should cite the waxing crescent wherever we may be in the world. All right, God bless all. Good night. We'll pick it up. I'll see you at Truth Frequency Radio tomorrow night. Be blessed.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.